The water bucket came up empty for the third time that morning, and Sarah Blackstone began to cry. Her well, the well her husband the mayor had declared the finest in Broken Ridge, had gone dry like all the others. The rope hung slack in her hands. The wooden bucket scraped against stone walls that should have been wet but weren't. And somewhere on the edge of town, in a direction she had forbidden her children to look, Reuben Hargrove's windmill kept turning. It had been turning for 3 years now, pumping water from a well so deep that everyone in Broken Ridge had called it madness. A well that had cost Reuben every penny he had, every friendship he'd made, every ounce of respect the town had ever given him. A well that was now the only source of water for 50 miles in any direction. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why Sarah Blackstone was crying beside a dry hole in July of 1886, you have to understand what Reuben Hargrove had learned in Pennsylvania before he ever set foot in Kansas, and why he spent 3 years digging while the whole town laughed. Reuben was born in 1834 in the coal country of western Pennsylvania, where his father worked the mines and his uncle worked something even deeper, the oil wells that were starting to change the world. Young Reuben spent his summers with his uncle, learning about aquifers and water tables and the layers of rock that sat between the surface and the underground rivers that most people never knew existed. Water is everywhere, his uncle told him. Deep enough down, there's always water. The trick is knowing how deep to dig and having the patience to get there. Most folks give up at 30 feet. The smart ones keep going. Reuben learned to read the land, to see where water collected, where it flowed, where it pooled in underground reservoirs that could supply 1,000 families if someone would just dig deep enough to reach them. He learned that shallow wells went dry in drought, but deep wells, wells that reached the true aquifer, kept flowing no matter what the weather did above. He came west in 1878, after the mines took his father and the oil company took his uncle's claim. He bought land outside a small Kansas settlement called Broken Ridge, married a woman named Ada, who shared his vision of a working farm, and started building the life he'd dreamed about since he was a boy, watching oil derricks punch through Pennsylvania stone. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. We'd love to know how far this story has traveled. The first thing Reuben did, before he built his cabin, before he bought his cattle, before he did anything else, was dig a test hole. He wanted to know what was under his land. He wanted to know how deep he'd have to go. What he found worried him. The water table was shallow, barely 20 feet down, which meant it would be easy to reach but impossible to rely on. Shallow water tables rose and fell with the seasons. In wet years, they'd have plenty. In dry years, they'd have nothing. He kept digging, 50 feet, 100 feet. At 120 feet, he hit solid limestone. Most men would have stopped there, would have declared the well finished and hoped for the best. But Reuben remembered what his uncle had taught him. He remembered that the best aquifers were below the limestone, in porous rock that held water like a sponge and released it slowly, steadily, forever. He stopped digging his test hole at 140 feet, where the limestone finally gave way to sandstone that wept with moisture. That was where the real water was. That was where he needed to build his well. But a well that deep would cost more than his entire homestead was worth. It would take years to dig by hand. It would require equipment that didn't exist in Broken Ridge, and expertise that nobody in Kansas possessed. The neighbors thought he was dreaming. The merchants thought he was crazy. And Mayor Emory Blackstone thought he was a fool who would be bankrupt within the year. "The Hargrove place has water at 20 feet, Blackstone announced at the town meeting in March of 1883. "Same as everyone else, but instead of digging a sensible well like a sensible man, he wants to dig clear to China. I say we let him. It'll be entertaining to watch." The laughter that followed would echo in Reuben's ears for 3 years. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It helps more than you know. Reuben started digging in April of 1883. He built a wooden derrick over the site, rigged a pulley system that would let him lower himself into the shaft and raise buckets of rock and soil, and began the slow, grinding work of cutting through the earth. 20 feet took a week. That was the easy part. Loose soil and soft clay that came up in heavy loads but didn't fight back. At 30 feet, he hit the first layer of harder rock and had to start using picks and chisels. At 50 feet, he was working in near darkness, lowering lanterns on ropes, breathing air that smelled like earth and time and the weight of the world above him. The work was dangerous. Twice he nearly suffocated when the air at the bottom of the shaft went bad, when the candle in his lantern flickered and died, and he had to scramble up the rope before his lungs gave out. Once he dropped a chisel and it fell 80 feet, striking sparks off the stone walls, and he realized that if he fell the same way, no one would find him until the vultures started circling. But he kept going, 60 feet, 70 feet, 80 feet, each foot harder than the last, each bucket of rock heavier than the one before. The townspeople came to watch. At first they came out of curiosity, wanting to see the madman's progress, wanting to confirm that he was actually doing what he'd said he would do. They would ride out on weekdays, peer down into the darkness of the shaft, and shake their heads at the foolishness of it all. Then they came to mock. Mayor Emory Blackstone organized Sunday viewing parties, where the respectable families of Broken Ridge would ride out to Reuben's property after church services and watch him emerge from his hole, covered in mud and dust, looking like something that had crawled up from the underworld. They brought picnic baskets and parasols. They made an afternoon of it. "How deep today, Hargrove?" Blackstone would call out, his voice carrying across the prairie. "Still digging your way to perdition?" 83 feet, Reuben would answer, or 94 feet, or 107. The numbers kept climbing. The laughter never stopped. The women were sometimes crueler than the men. They would whisper about Ada Hargrove, wondering aloud what kind of wife would let her husband waste their future on a hole in the ground. They speculated about the state of the Hargrove finances, about how long until the bank took the farm, about whether Ada would be better off as a widow than as the wife of a madman. The children learned the mockery from their parents. They called the Hargrove children mole rats and dirt diggers, and worse. They threw stones at Reuben's son when he came to town for supplies. They made the Hargrove daughter cry at the schoolhouse until she stopped attending. Ada stood by him through all of it. She kept the farm running while Reuben spent his days in the hole, feeding the livestock, tending the garden, doing the work of 2 people because her husband was chasing something that most people thought didn't exist. When the neighbors' wives stopped inviting her to quilting circles, she quilted alone. When the children at the schoolhouse started calling the Hargrove children the Mole family, she taught them at home. "They'll understand someday," she told Reuben on the nights when he came up from the shaft, too exhausted to eat, too discouraged to speak. "When the drought comes, and it will come, they'll understand." "What if it doesn't come?" Reuben asked once, in a moment of doubt. "What if I'm wrong about all of it?" "You're not wrong," Ada said. "Your uncle taught you true. The drought will come, and when it does, we'll be ready." The drought came in 1886. It started in March when the spring rains failed to materialize. The farmers watched the sky and waited, telling each other that the rains would come next week, next month, any day now. But the sky stayed clear, the sun beat down, and the creeks began to slow. By April, the creek that ran through the center of Broken Ridge had slowed to a trickle. By May, it was a dry bed of cracked mud and desperate memories. By June, the shallow wells were starting to fail, one by one, bucket by bucket, until the townspeople were hauling water from the river 12 miles away. They made the trip every day at first, then every other day as the river dropped lower and lower. The journey took 6 hours round trip. The water they brought back was muddy and warm and tasted like desperation. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. The river dried up in July. The hottest July anyone in Kansas could remember. Temperatures that cracked the ground and killed the crops and left cattle bellowing for water that didn't exist. The townspeople watched their livestock die. They counted the cattle that fell each day, dragged the carcasses away from the wells that were already dry, tried not to think about what would happen when the last animals were gone. They watched their gardens wither, the vegetables they had planted in spring curling and browning and turning to dust. They watched their dreams of prosperity evaporate in the relentless Kansas sun. The children suffered most. Their lips cracked and bled from dehydration. Their eyes grew dull. They stopped playing, stopped running, stopped doing anything but sitting in whatever shade they could find and waiting for water that never came. The mothers rationed what little they had, a cup here, a cup there, never enough. The fathers rode out across the prairie looking for any source of water they might have missed, any buffalo wallow or hidden spring, and came back empty-handed and hollow-eyed. And through all of it, they watched Reuben Hargrove's windmill keep turning. He had finished the well 6 months earlier, 147 feet of hand-dug shaft, lined with stone he'd hauled from a quarry 30 miles away, capped with a windmill that pumped water from depths that the drought couldn't reach. The aquifer he'd found wasn't connected to the shallow water table that everyone else relied on. It was fed by underground rivers that had been flowing since before humans walked the earth. Water that would keep flowing long after everyone alive today was dust. The windmill turned, the water flowed, and the people who had mocked Reuben for 3 years watched from a distance, too proud to ask for help, too desperate to do anything else. The first person to come asking for water was Sarah Blackstone. She came alone, without her husband, carrying empty buckets and a pride that had been broken by necessity. Her children were sick from drinking muddy water they'd collected from a buffalo wallow. Her youngest had stopped crying 2 days ago, not because she was better, but because she was too weak to cry. Her livestock were dying. Her home was becoming a grave. "I know what my husband said about you," she told Reuben, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know how we treated you. I know what the town said, what I said, what everyone said. I'm not asking for myself. I'm asking for my children." Reuben looked at her for a long moment, looked at the woman whose husband had organized the mockery, whose laughter had rung loudest at the Sunday viewing parties, whose contempt for his pointless well had been a constant feature of Broken Ridge society for 3 years. He remembered every insult, every joke, every time his children had come home crying because of what the Blackstone children had said to them. Then he filled her buckets and handed them back. "Bring your children," he said. "Bring your husband. Bring anyone who needs water. There's enough for everyone." Sarah Blackstone wept. She stood there in the Kansas sun, holding buckets of water that would save her children's lives, and wept like she hadn't wept since she was a child herself. "Why?" she asked. "After everything we did to you, why?" "Because water doesn't care who mocked whom," Reuben said, "and neither do I, not anymore." The word spread across Broken Ridge like the drought had spread across Kansas, fast and unstoppable. By nightfall, there were a dozen families camped around Reuben's well, filling buckets and barrels, drinking their fill for the first time in weeks. By the second day, there were 50. Wagons lined up along the road to the Hargrove place. Families who had never spoken to Reuben except to ridicule him now, waiting patiently for their turn at his well. By the end of the week, every family in Broken Ridge had made the pilgrimage to the Hargrove place, buckets in hand, pride in tatters, asking for water from the well they had mocked for 3 years. Reuben gave it to them, all of them. He organized a rotation so that everyone got water every day. He let families camp on his land while they waited their turn. He shared his food, his shelter, his everything, not because he had forgiven the mockery, but because forgiveness wasn't the point. Survival was the point, and survival meant sharing. Even Emory Blackstone came eventually. He came last of all, when everyone else in town had already made their peace with the man they had ridiculed, when there was no one left to impress with his stubbornness. He came with his frock coat dusty and his hat in his hands, unable to meet Reuben's eyes. "I owe you an apology," Blackstone said. The words came hard, harder than anything he had ever said. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you everything, my wife, my children, my livestock. Everything I have left, I have because of your well." "You owe me nothing," Reuben said. "The water belongs to the land. I just dug deep enough to find it." "I organized those Sunday parties," Blackstone continued, as if he hadn't heard. "I called you a fool. I made your family outcasts. I did everything I could to make your life miserable, and you saved my children anyway. I don't understand." Reuben was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My uncle taught me that water is everywhere, deep enough down. He also taught me that grudges are like shallow wells. They dry up when you need them most. I didn't dig this well to prove you wrong, Emory. I dug it because I knew the drought would come, and I'm sharing it because that's what water is for." The crisis lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of hauling water from Reuben's well to every farm in Broken Ridge. 6 weeks of watching his windmill turn while everything else stood still. 6 weeks of learning what the townspeople had refused to learn when learning would have been easy. That shallow preparations fail when true hardship comes, and only those who dig deeper survive. Thank you for watching this story about Reuben Hargrove and Broken Ridge. If it meant something to you, hit subscribe and the bell icon so you never miss when we release a new story. The drought broke in August, when the rains finally came and the creeks started flowing again. But things in Broken Ridge had changed. The shallow wells refilled, but nobody trusted them anymore. Within 2 years, every farm in the county had dug a deep well, not as deep as Reuben's, perhaps, but deep enough to reach the aquifer that he had proven existed. Reuben became a teacher instead of a mockery. He showed his neighbors how to read the land, how to find the seams where water flowed, how to dig past the limestone and into the sandstone where the real reserves lay waiting. He taught them what his uncle had taught him in Pennsylvania, that water is everywhere, deep enough down, and the trick is having the patience to reach it. The phrase entered the vocabulary of Broken Ridge, and eventually the vocabulary of Kansas itself. Dig like Hargrove became shorthand for doing something right the first time, for building something that would last, for ignoring the mockers and trusting your own knowledge. When new homesteaders arrived in the territory and asked the locals for advice, the answer was always the same: dig like Hargrove. Emory Blackstone served out the rest of his term as mayor, but never ran for re-election. He spent his remaining years as a quiet presence in Broken Ridge, quick to admit his mistake to anyone who would listen, quicker still to point newcomers toward Reuben's farm if they wanted to learn how to build a well that would last. Reuben lived until 1912, long enough to see his well still flowing, long enough to see 100 wells dug on his model, long enough to know that what he had built would outlast him by generations. His horse Anvil died in 1891, and Reuben buried him on the hill overlooking the well, the same hill where Reuben himself would eventually be buried, beside Ada, with a headstone that read simply, "He dug deep." The well is still there. 140 years later, it's still producing water. The windmill has been replaced twice. The stone lining has been repaired 3 times, but the shaft itself, the hole that Reuben Hargrove dug by hand over 3 years while his neighbors laughed, is exactly as he left it. And every summer, when the shallow wells in the county start running low, the farmers still make the drive to the old Hargrove place to fill their tanks from the well that never runs dry. Some people dig just deep enough to reach water. Others dig deep enough to reach the water that lasts. Reuben Hargrove knew the difference, and a town that mocked him learned it the hard way. The well is still flowing. The lesson is still true. And somewhere in Kansas, people are still digging like Hargrove. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier wisdom and the quiet vindication of those who knew better all along.